thank you everyone for coming to this event, online and in person. Thank you to Université Ouverte, Candice and Laurie for inviting me, for organizing these talks. Thank you for CLACS, the Center for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Queer Studies at University of New York for co-badging the event. So I am Sandeep Bakshi, and I've been working here for the last 8 years now. And I have been trained in queer, postcolonial, decolonial studies, transnationally. So when I arrived in France, of course, it was but natural that I would continue what I had been doing. So I'd like to call my current research that lies at the intersection of queer and decolonial theorization, with a sustained interest in what Michel Foucault said, and then Stuart Hall as well said, the history of the present, or how do we diagnose the present, or the present condition. It allows us a diagnosis of cultures, literatures, representations of our contemporary era. Specifically in relation to the embedded fractures that have been created through epistemic erasures, through substitution, through homo and transphobia, and enduring misogyny and casteism, as well as the impulse, why we make these interventions, why we come to these presentations, is also this impulse of repair. What do we do now that we are here today? What do we do now? And that has been, for the last decade or so, the premise of the key focus of my academic labor. So in what follows, I will present a portion of my work on decolonial and queer theorization that I began with the Decolonizing Sexualities Network, which I run ever since 2010. And the first book that came out in 2016, and the special issue in 2020. So it's almost 10 years since the book came out, called Decolonizing Sexualities. And so I'm wondering, where is my research taking me today after that decade-long engagement with decolonial theorization and queer frames? So for me, the interconnections between the rubrics of what we call decolonial and queer, they should operate as an axiomatic, that they should operate together, and that should be evidence. That should be axiomatic. It does require rigorous theorization of reading, wading through a lot what queer theorists and decolonial theorists have said, but also in terms of praxis. And I will give you specific examples today of what is the cultural script of our contemporary times. How do we make it legible? Right? We've received a lot of visuals, Sign of Our Times is about the visuals, the scrolling that we keep on doing, the narratives that have traversed disparate temporal and geographical, geopolitical locations, and that need further scrutiny. So critical intersections of decolonial theorization and queer studies have emerged in the last 2 decades. The resulting field is a disparate, uneven formation, but they have established several points of imbricating discourses. Borrowing from genealogies of transnational feminisms, queer of color critique, queer race and migration studies, and Black queer diasporas, amongst others, this newly emerging field of inquiry has allowed nuanced and extended analyses of contemporary queer power imbalance instituted through mechanisms of domination in colonial and post-colonial times. And yet, notwithstanding this expanding body of literature, substantial obfuscations pertaining to the import of what decolonial queer thinking is are prevalent. Therefore, I turn to these points of crossings of decolonial and queer theorizations that have allowed a consolidation of this field of inquiry. Are you able to see my online? Yes, but here, there we are. Okay, yeah, well. So there have been intentional or unintentional erasures, obliterations, substitutions, to borrow from Mary Louise Pratt's work on planetary longings, in formation of knowledge systems in the global north. Despite the multifarious genealogy of queer or color critique, the explicit attachment of queerness to decoloniality remains comparatively recent. And it is the work that we've been implicated in since 2010 with the Decolonizing Sexualities Network with transnational affiliations. So I was based in Britain and France, my colleagues in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe, Germany, and also the Global South, in India, Palestine, and Kashmir, Uganda, and Dominica, to name but a few. And so I continue to pry open the space of decolonial queerness, reflecting on a burgeoning field of knowledge that enacts a refusal, a queer refusal, such as either or. The imperative of either or, either you're with us or you're against us. Whereas what the decolonial queer framework would conceptualize is the and, not the but. The grammar is about and. So race within queer frameworks works as what Stuart Hall called the floating signifier. It is hardly an outlier in decolonial studies. Within decolonial studies, Aníbal Quijano's work centering race, he identifies race as, and I cite, one fundamental aspect of the logic of coloniality, and the most efficient instrument of social domination. This is Quijano in the essay Questioning Race. Earlier anti-colonial thinking, such as Aimé Césaire in France, Martinique, from which decolonial thinking evolved in one sense, found an equal implication of race and colonialism, such that Césaire and later Frantz Fanon reflected upon the position of blackness and Africanness in their works. Recent work that has been included within the remit of decolonial theorisation arises from crossings with Black studies and indigenous theories. So just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from and where I'm going, in 2001, the publication of Chiffon Somerville's Queering the Color Line and the 2003 publication of Roderick Ferguson's Aberrations in Black Toward a Queer of Color Critique, race and negative racialization have inserted themselves into a critical parameter of queer studies. Ferguson asserts that it's not changing, right? Yeah. You can only see it online, but we're having technical issues here for the slides. Yeah, so every time I have to. Okay. As an effort designed to address connections between race, sexuality, and political economy, queer of color critique had to begin by confronting a founding limitation of queer studies. And this is what Ferguson argues in his work, Aberrations in Black, about the founding limitation in queer studies. That limitation had to do with an initial ambivalence within queer studies about the connections that sexuality has to other modes of difference. The elision of race and migration points to the founding limitation within queer studies, as Ferguson avers. The connectors of decolonial queer frameworks function therefore as crossing lines, such that transformation can become a realizable goal. Within queer studies, just to give you an example, especially in its decolonial queer avatar that we are fashioning, Judith Butler's primacy within the field has resulted in the erasure of Oironke Oibumi's formulation of woman as a non-category. Few scholars make that critique, of course. So if you do queer studies, the first thing about woman being a non-category, everyone is citing Judith Butler, but Oironke Oibumi at the same time had published about how the category of gender or woman was an imposition. As Paola Baketta asserts, queer theory remains substantively colonialism and race amnesiac. And she terms theories circulating between the global norths and souths through corrupt practices of citationality, which erases queer subalternized formations of knowledge. Baketta defines white theory, of course, not in essentialist or morphological terms according to the racial positionality or body representation of the person, but instead in epistemological terms according to its approach, presuppositions, categories, logic, and conclusions. Not online?
No.
Yeah. Sorry about the technical glitches. White theory can be characterized primarily by what it neglects. It forgets to address colonialism, racism, Islamophobia, capitalism, class relations, and other relations of power. Decolonial queerness or sexualities can only operate as a transformative analytic, as we see, when it critiques both global north and south systems of power along the axis of how resources are redistributed, how they become attached to power, thereby strengthening existing systems of hierarchy. So how do we make space for decolonial, or clear space for decolonial queerness that borrows both from queer and decolonial studies and is the field I'm currently attempting to define and consolidate through the Decolonizing Sexualities Network? In our contemporary era, every aspect of our existence is scrutinized through the lens of the decolonial or decolonization. Everything is being decolonized. When we attempt to decolonize all relations of power, I'm not actually critical of decolonizing everything, but decolonization has a particular meaning as well. We can understand our world through an epistemic decolonization, yes, but at the same time, when we are trying to decolonize eating, food, sleep, etc., I don't know what we are trying to achieve, right? So yes, decolonization, but there is a history of decolonization that I'd now like to point to. Allow me to begin with the African feminist scholar Sylvia Tamale, who assessed what has been termed the fallist movements. Like Rhodes Must Fall and all the statues being toppled in Africa, in Europe, and elsewhere in the United States, and movements that followed. So in Tamale's view, decolonization, when put in the context of fallist movements, or even independence struggles, or what we call formal decolonization movements, they fail their promise of liberation with not implicating into their frames inevitable questions of genders, sexualities, disabilities, and other forms of marginalization. You may have recently watched that documentary about André Blouin. Not many people know who André Blouin was, but André Blouin was a feminist, a woman freedom fighter from the Congo, as good as Patrice Lumumba, but we only hear about Patrice Lumumba and never about André Blouin. You may have heard of Aimé Césaire, but you have probably not heard of Paulette Nardal. Paulette Nardal was the first person who actually introduced the concept of negritude, and she was honored at the French Olympics recently when her statue was unveiled. So this is the kind of erasures that I'm talking about within even social justice movements, that we come with these erasures, whether intentional or unintentional, and that produces the knowledge that we have today. Right. Following on from Tamale, I would think that the elision of trans and queer frames in, let us call them, social justice movements, for instance, because that's what they are, is a significant oversight. And it produces exclusions, but also serious impediments to collective emancipation. The systematic exclusion of non-Western, non-white manifestations of queerness as lying either outside the purview of queerness constructs a teleological narrative of first in the West, then the rest. That becomes normalized. This is where decolonial queerness relies on decolonial thinking of modernity, coloniality, whereby the Eurocentered pride of, say, same-sex marriage, homoparenting, becomes an ultimate goal of queer mobilization transnationally. So everyone should follow a particular script of, going to prides, coming out, having children, etc. There's a script which creates, for me, a coloniality of sexuality. Now, there have been work by Professor Tami Ayush, who works here in the Université Cité, whose work is really important, who talks about sexuality as not the overarching signifier for everyone. Everyone does talk about sexuality all over the world, but sexuality is not the first identification for everyone in the world. He was talking, of course, about Moroccan sexualities. So given the multitudinous, does it work? No, that doesn't work. Now it's good? Online is good? Yeah, okay. Given the multitudinous orientations of the field of decolonial studies, the attempt to delineate decolonial queerness in an overt manner bears critical focus on the interimplication of genders and sexualities in coloniality. In order to counter the absence of decolonial analyses of queerness, the visible connection of queer to decoloniality reveals the functioning of coloniality of power in intimate relations. The cultural script of our times, of our current conjuncture, marred by multiple wars, genocides in various parts of the world, in Kashmir, in Gaza, in Congo, in Sudan, and beyond, is one of death. We are just surrounded by death, destruction. Our current moment, defined by death, ecocide, scholasticide, has crystallized over centuries of unstable and compounding power hierarchies that attach to the push and pull of violence on a regular basis. Now, this throbbing, pulsating machine makes visible recursive regimes, to borrow from Alana Lenton, that regulate processes of racialization, negative racialization, and inequitable distribution of resources and indexes of livability. I will talk about livability towards the end. It's a notion of black livability that I have borrowed from the professor Rinaldo Wolcott. Queer, trans, intersex, and those bodies deemed non-normative through suturing to negative racialization or gender or caste or religion or ability have always been the subject of excision from the convention. They have always been excluded from the convention, so they know what they are talking about when they talk about death, whether physically, mentally, materially, and biopolitically. And they have always suffered epistemic erasure. Violence is a part of life. Thus, the idea of livability in the face of extreme opposition operating through securitization of borders, biopolitical stronghold on queer and racialized bodies is indeed a challenge of our times. So the question impelling this reflection center on operations of queer praxis in our violent era, operations which allow our generations to discuss emancipation without attaching it to demands of extreme racial and cultural violence. So if you look at the Human Rights Campaign, so this is something in 2024, Human Rights Campaign, on their online website, they have this statistics in 2024, how many people died, and 78% were people of color, 56 were black transgender women, 42 knew the killer, and 38% were misgendered, and 63% were killed by a gun. And they have listed all the names, all the people who died, and their photographs. So this is just one of that photograph of an 18-year-old girl who died because of transphobia, who was murdered because of transphobia. So along with scholars transnationally, the key question that I'm asking is, how is decoloniality activated? What do we do in the face of so much death, right? How do I activate decoloniality in these troubled and different sites and situated temporal multiplicities in regard to queerness? How do we make the connections that there emerges a fuller comprehension of our existence and present? In order to comprehend the operations of an ongoing cultural script of violence with several other readings, I tender a reading following Fanon and his formulation of death during and in colonialism. Even though in his later writings on Algeria, Fanon replaced colonialism with occupation to demonstrate its intensity. Death, in the case and for the colonized and oppressed, becomes the overarching signifier of life. So I think I will not, I'm in France, so I think you can all read what is in French, une mort dans la vie, which is literally a death in life. This is how death surrounds people who do not have power. And this is Fanon talking to us about also about in more atmospheric. Now, in more atmospheric, in medicine and colonialism, on the late stages of colonization in Algeria, Fanon calls it the more atmospheric of the oppressed. I am not sure that I want to call it an omnipresent death. I would still call it, because I don't think in French it means anything in more atmospheric. But the way he's describing is that, surrounding death, that surrounds you. And I would still call it a more atmospheric, because it's also an atmospheric death, and not omnipresent death, as has been translated in the original translation. Because this idea of surrounding, death that surrounds you can still be that atmosphere, that is created, or death in its absolute form. Drawing upon this notion of atmospheric death or omnipresent death, decolonial queer readings attend to the cultural script of death as evidence in its continuity, and I'm borrowing from Jaspir Poir here, especially in the violence enacted upon occupied populations as well as queer and trans communities, who suffer communal death, social death, and this more atmospheric. The idea that this is something original, that this is something novel, something recent, is flawed. I'm not presenting any recent idea. I'm just coming from Fanon. Since the continuity of this death has passed, that has been erased from our view. These deaths have always existed, but they have been invisibilized, especially in terms of colonial massacres, complete wipeout of bloodlines and generations, and so on. And for queer and trans populations, this archive of death bears continuity as well. Everyone just wanted to kill queer and trans people. And there are notable traces of this violence, that connects the massacres of, let's say, the castratas in pre-19th century Italy, where absolutely the castratas were massacred in large numbers. And I think one of the fictional narrative that we have today is Foucault's Herculine Barbin, on the intersex violence that happened in the 19th century. And then it came to the British colonies, to Palestine, to Abu Ghraib in Iraq. The violence enacted upon trans and queer bodies operates and haunts colonial governance in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, and biopolitical securitization in the contemporary period. So my example today, this control exercised, and how, this has a genealogy, this creation of death has a genealogy for queer and trans people, is about the British administrators in India in the late 19th century, 1850s, 70s onwards. So the medical pathologization that happened for queer and trans bodies and intersex bodies led to the violence that traversed not only the Eurocolonial Center. Remember, in 1890 it was about Oscar Wilde, but it had already come through India in 1870 when Britain passed the Criminal Tribes Act. Why did they pass the Criminal Tribes Act? So shortly after 1850, to the early decades of the 20th century in British India, British administrators, and this is G. Semela's work on the colonial archive and sexuality, British administrators claimed that hijras, so hijras are populations who are now called transgender populations in India, that hijras or eunuchs in colonial parlance were habitual sodomites, beggars, obscene presence in public space, and the kidnappers and castrators of children. This myth of kidnappers and castrators of children exists in the contemporary period as well. So this is a colonial legacy that we have. In 1865, the Northwest Province in India declared that its aim was to reduce the number of eunuchs and thus gradually lead to their extinction, elimination, extinction, death, right? This is literally what the archive is saying. And so in 1871, the British passed the Criminal Tribes Act in 1871 with a view to regulating alleged sexual and gender deviance. Not only an integral parcel of the civilizing mission, the extinction of hijras is the civilizing mission, the outright elimination of hijra population was written into colonial governance. Violence in queer and trans bodies, as I emphasized, comprises the inherent cultural script of colonialism, which is present even today in post-colonial societies. Going beyond colonial eras, at perpetually post-colonial nations either continue criminal laws on homosexuality. India declared homosexuality legal only in 2018. Singapore declared in 23 or 22, later than 2018. So you see, it took almost 70 years for people to start claiming that homosexuality was not illegal, which was, of course, a remnant of the colonial era. And what we are witnessing currently in Uganda also has a colonial script, because the laws that have been written during the British era are now consolidated by the US missionaries. The Afghanistan and Iraq war on terror of how homophobia and misogyny linked to penetration and sodomy bespeaks a cultural script that feeds on making populations and communities extinct. The gendered and sexual violence enacted upon the hijra bodies participates in a continuum of death, destruction, and elimination. So how do we survive? How do we exist? Hijra populations have existed. They exist even today. They survived this. So Semela's research delivers a promise of existence and not extinction. And this is what I'm interested in. How do we exist in this particular moment? The organization of hijra communities as those built on solidarity with each other enable them to survive and negotiate their existence, first with the colonial administrators and subsequently with the post-colonial government. The gendered and sexual violence to the hijra bodies, as I've suggested, participates not only in a continuum of death, but also it propels them into action so that they can exist. And this does not end in 1865. On the 1st of December 1952, the Daily News published one such story. Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. Of existence. An ex-GI becomes blonde beauty. An ex-GI, following the gender affirmation, appeared as Christine Jorgensen. Even though the US government denied gender affirmation at that particular time, the ex-GI found possible in Sweden this gender reassignment, gender affirmation. So it was a story of where there's a will, there's a way. Jorgensen became allowed an affirmation of existence. Now the decolonial queer framework would probably assess Jorgensen's past as ex-GI, will tell us how to move forward in times of death and destruction when, of course, Jorgensen was a soldier. It is for the moment critical to pause and allow the ramifications of the current war on trans. After J.K. Rowling's malicious campaign of transexation from society, a concerted effort to define and exclude from the category of woman has emerged in our times. This effort is inherently misogynistic in its impulse, much as it is spearheaded by trans-exclusive radical feminists. How do you define who is a woman? I think the British have been at it ever since they saw the hijras and claiming that, they are not women. So we have to define what a woman is. And in a round circle, now the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom has passed a law on what constitutes a woman, basically biology, and which leaves out trans women totally out of the purview of who is protected as a woman. Whereas another clarification that came, so this is Sarah McBride, who was speaking to the supporters after winning the primary. And, this was the Democrats telling the grand old party, the GOP in 2024, that they should stop dehumanizing people. Dehumanize, the idea of the human, of course. And so it is interesting that what happened is that just following the UK Supreme Court's decision, the Indian one of the Indian high courts also issued a statement saying women includes every woman, including trans women. So we saw a whole change of pattern. So this violence of exclusion that always comes is, in my view, predicated upon exclusion from humanity. Exclusion from humanity of racialized bodies, of trans bodies, of non-normative bodies, of queer bodies, and gender and sexuality configurations. The idea of Fanonian atmospheric death evolves through the creation of recurrent regimes of violence, which obviously includes epistemic violence and erasure. An exclusionary violence that accompanies regulation of queerness operates as what Walter Mignolo has called the abstract universal, a term that is tethered to the frame of sexuality as a human right. The multiple crises pertaining to the term universalism produced in the second half of the 20th century defy the logic of critique, since they address, in a substantive manner, the exclusionary impulse of how the term gives meaning to the imbalance of power in our times. The contestation of an abstract universal humanity, founded, of course, during the European Enlightenment, when colonization and conquest were in conjunction with the Enlightenment humanism, coeval with Eurocolonialism, enslavement, consolidation of racialization and exploitation has allowed, so these contestations have allowed discussions to signal the exclusionary quality of universalism. Whilst coloniality of power operates as one of the significant markers of Eurocolonial legacies through the defining imbalance of racialized hierarchies, the exclusionary universal formation that it generates impacts all global relations today. So Walter Mignolo queries the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that were written into existence, and I cite, to correct the errors and mistakes made by a handful of Western European states and the US. For Mignolo, the conception of communal living rights, this is really interesting about communal living rights as opposed to, or it's not really as opposed to, in conjunction with human rights. Communal living rights entails reorienting the discussion to the origin of human rights, both when and how of their invention, whether it's Iran, whether it's someone else, along with how Westernization became an inexorable imposition. Asserting the significance of communal human living rights, Mignolo critiques the imperial rhetoric of modernity that conceals the universal from universalism itself by denying the humanity of others and projecting the violence onto others. So in a similar vein, within queer theorization, anti-normativity has emerged as a predominant characteristic in the Western academy, such that any dissociation from it, even minor, remain largely peripheral. Queer anti-normative functions as normative, as entanglements of universalism largely figuring in three frameworks of social formations, such as north-south circulation of knowledge, continuation of coloniality of race, and interventions in human rights discourse. So in line with the Euro-centered universal, like what a universal should be, the abstract universal, global North queer ways of doing and believing as an anti-normative function as a colonial site of privilege, right? So interpreting and imposing the particularism of European queerness as universal queerness. I don't know if you're aware of what was happening in 2011 in the United Kingdom, or perhaps also in France, I may not be aware, but what was happening in the United Kingdom in 2011 was the queer and trans refugees who came to Britain to seek asylum, they were asked whether they knew, mind you, from Asia and Africa, mostly from Africa, but also beyond, they were asked if they knew or if they could sing a song by Kylie Minogue. It was a type of, queerness that was asked of them. Can you sing songs by Kylie Minogue? Even I can't sing songs of Kylie Minogue. It's just too far for me. But the queer universal develops through modes of being queer, dictating a sequence of queer ways of existing in the world. And this sequence is, you grow up, you learn that you're queer, you come out, and then you decide whether you want to live with your family or not, etc., and it goes on. Just like a very, it's not a fractured script. It is what you are. There is an injunction to do the whole thing, which is queer. And of course, it reproduces, the idea that this is how it is supposed to be done when you want to be queer. The global South, in this case, with Kylie Minogue, for instance, the global South is corralled into a teleological relationship with the global North as the leader of queer universalism, similar to human rights discursive formation. It is a political economy of North-South circulation of queer knowledge that the primacy of Western queer cultural practices, such as drag and its concomitant theorisation, materialize as universal templates. So there has been some discussion online and otherwise about whether hijras, the eunuchs that we were talking about, they're not eunuchs, but trans, who have a cultural, which is a cultural template in South Asia, whether they can consider drag or not. So the only reference point we have is drag. And, so many other forms of existence are totally corralled into believing that they have to subscribe to drag, which is really scary, right? So, and it is certainly in this context that, the soldier in drag performance, the appearance in various wars and terror and genocidal occupation, that we must consider the violence of homophobia within Western and other colonial representations of sexuality in war. So the Queer Eye for Straight Eye did a Saddam number. Can you believe it? I mean, the amount of homophobia that has to, ingrained homophobia that has to go into thinking that Saddam, sodomy, all of that is together, right? And so the soldier in drag appearance, we've been seeing all these visuals of soldiers in drag appearance, right? I don't have to remind you. For instance, the attachment of sodomy to Saddam Hussein, or as Humadar suggests, in the case of Kashmiri freedom fighters who in their death are mocked through misogyny and effeminacy in their caricatures. So Humadar works on Kashmir, on Indian-occupied Kashmir, and when one of the Kashmiri activists died because the government killed them, there was this whole, the online pictures that appear was this Kashmiri militant with a lot of makeup, and, those kind of scrubbed out makeup so that, they would not resemble whatever they think that person resembles. So it's a way, and nobody said a word. Feminists did not say a word. That you mean to say anyone putting makeup is, is beneath you? Is that what you're what it's supposed to mean? And nobody said a word. So there's the idea that you can actually rein in queer forces and then serve as homophobia in the case of Saddam Hussein's sodomy, or misogyny, as in the case of, and that is acceptable to queer people because the horrible either you're with him or you're not with him. The Manichaean that Fanon talked about as well, discussed as well. The Manichaean distinction between good and bad forces, and that we are supposed to just take it in and say nothing about it because it's advancement of queer rights is a typically flawed idea, right? And so the image that you can see of Saddam Hussein was retrieved through the site of Paul Allotson, who has it on his site and who received this image by email. And the second image that you see of the gay Palestinian pride and land rights for gay Arabs and gay Israeli Arabs is a cartoon that appeared in Gedalia in 2024. Queer interventions in the human rights discourse as a universal further allows the construction of the homophobic other, especially if they are Muslim and or Black or migrant communities. The polarization bolsters cultural and religious difference that naturalizes the radical exceptionalism of global North as a site of emancipatory same-sex sexuality. So what it does is it allows the attribution of human rights and preservation on certain Euro-US communities. They completely disregard pinkwashing strategies, tokenized queer asylum seekers as part of the community fabric, thereby obfuscating violent border regimes. In 2012, the Belgian Pride was opened by a Black African asylum seeker with "Thank you, Belgium." Yes, that was the Pride. So it is typically allowing, Belgium to show itself as the beacon of queer rights, which allowed one person to come and seek asylum, and that person becomes the face of the country. So relying on the language of queer rights, Muslim majority countries such as, and we've seen that, this injunction to say that Iran or Afghanistan or Palestine, they have to accept homosexuality or that they're homophobic. The process of racialization and sexualization become firmly suited to narratives originating in conquest and colonization. So there is an injunction, always to, you have to say that you're not homophobic. Whereas, the cultural script of many countries, of many cultures, of many religions is very different, which cannot be understood through Western formations of homophobia, right? So what do we do in the face of, this kind of cooptation of queer rights, etc.? One aspect of decolonial queer studies is the Queer Act of Refusal, which functions as praxis. And I like to bring back the idea of praxis in the sense that Maria Lugones imagined political praxis in her earlier work, in Pilgrimages. That is to say, the connection to our collective doing. The attenuated, even though it allows attenuated sense of agency, she says, it is not inconsequential. That means that we have to turn our theory into practice. So as an example, it has been possible to resist narratives of same-sex marriage when we consider the work of the Collective Against Equality that highlighted the inclusion of queer and trans people within the institution of marriage, along with their inclusion in war. So Semela's research instructs us, as I said, despite colonial governance of sexuality of non-normative bodies, Hijra communities did not become extinct as was the plan. Despite the violence, despite the atmospheric death, and there is then a certain praxis of livability or survival that requires substantive focus. I use the term praxis following Lugones to signify, and this is what she says, the indissoluble link between theory and practice. In his work on Black queer diasporas, Rinaldo Walcott re-envisions a queer framework as infused, and I'm citing him, as infused, by a politics of reconnection and reparation attending to Black livability in the face of Black death. The central concern remains the desire for justice and freedom for such a politics to emerge. Borrowing from Edward Glisson's formulation of natural poetics, Walcott proposes Black queer articulation as a homopoetics of relation, which produces modes of being that are both in concert with and against hegemonic gay and lesbian identities, homonormative inclusion, and Black homophobia. In some, Black queer diasporic studies foregrounds the inveterate connections of sexuality and gender to other modes of difference, broadening the scope of queer studies, and in the process, clearing space for emancipation based on new human possibilities of justice. So if you see Against Equality, they came out with this book, and then the three of them, I think the platform ran up until 2017, and after 2017, the platform was archived. So the enactment of queer refusal is one such possibility of reparation of this homopoetics of relation that Rinaldo Walcott formulates. One instance that emerged was after the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the United States, whereby queer subjects were called into the nation as full citizens if they went into war, of course. The group Against Equality, formed by academics and activists Karma Chavez, Yasmin Nair, and Ryan Conrad around 2009, 2010, and that continued to exist until 2017, resisted the call to rein in queer subjects basically as fodder for war in Afghanistan. So at that particular time, in 2013, when Karma Chavez was invited at Birkbeck and through Decolonizing Sexualities Network, they were attacked. That, whether or not we want the war or not, certain deprived communities can find employment in that. So it was at that in 2010, 2013, up until 2013, it was quite a novel idea to say that we're not for this equality, that we don't want to go to war, and so the position, even though at that particular time mightily attacked by queer liberal organizations and individuals, since the war machine meant employment for several immiserated communities, the argument put forth against equality concerned the failure of the most powerful state in the history of the world to provide for its citizens without recourse to war. And that argument today is very, very commonplace. This simple and very logical point, which wasn't acceptable at that time during the war in Afghanistan, has now become a favored position, and its unviability, despite a favored position on war and its unviability, despite different other formulations of liberal conservative attitudes to queerness itself that have emerged, like we've seen the war on trans. It is important to say that Against Equality as a group created the conditions of queer livability, as Walcott reminds us, through understanding queer praxis as an instance of solidarity. To put it simply, our emancipation, our livability, depends entirely on human communal rights. The connection of solidarity with all communities that can be established and nurtured. So I'm not sure, if someone is lying under the rubble, if Palestinians are lying under the rubble, and my first instance is, oh, he is homophobic, I'm not going to save them, then the problem is me, not the person who is under the rubble, right? Someone said on social media that, probably what we need to do is to first teach them gender 101, and then we can save them. It's literally our humanity that depends on this extension of solidarity, but apparently no. Maria Lugones, and I'm almost finished. Maria Lugones instructs us that sometimes it is not how far one moves, but how one moves. Within what complexities and against what simplifications of histories, geographies, and meanings. If oppressions intermesh but are represented as interlocking, oppressed people are categorically lumped together and categorically broken from each other. Then if the resistance are not going to follow the logic of the representation, a logic tied to purity as an instrument of social control, the resistors must be ready to intervene in the categorical separations and the categorical lumping together of peoples in a struggle to connect with each other. So when Walcott is talking about reparation and connection, Lugones is also talking about this connection, you see, as colonial difference creates excess of difference between communities, between peoples. Queer enactments of refusal to participate in this formation of difference, queer enactments of refusal and livability relies on erasing that difference to find life with each other of those who remain on our planet, because several lives have been lost. From a founding limitation in queer studies, decolonial queer studies then allows us a hold on the anchor of not refusing difference, but refusing its weaponization, its cooptation by dominant forces of exclusion, elimination, and dehumanization. Thank you.